Hi everybody, welcome to week 3 of our course. This week we're going to be looking at a method that is very different from the first two that we looked at in the first 2 weeks. This week we're looking at the direct method, and I want to draw your attention to some special connections that this method has, especially to Gratz. If you've been to the college, or if you ever get a chance to visit, you'll find out that the second floor of our building is entirely devoted to the library. And there are a few offices, but for the most part, it is the library. And this is the large, most beautiful room in the building. It's called the Elsie and William Chomsky Reading Room. It got its name from two faculty members who made incredible contributions to Gratz. Elsie Chomsky was the first woman hired full-time as a faculty member. She was married to William Chomsky, who was the Hebrew professor at Gratz that made enormous contributions to the college. And we're going to be talking about him and a little bit about the extended family this week. So William, or Zev, or Velvel Chomsky was born in 1896 in the village of Kupil in the Volhynian district of the Russian Empire, which is now located in Ukraine. At the time that he was growing up, it was not uncommon for the Tsar to send his army into the villages, especially into the Jewish villages, and to look for adolescent boys on the street, sometimes as young as 8, who were then grabbed off the street and conscripted forcefully into the Tsar's army. Chomsky really wanted to avoid getting caught up in the army, and his parents also certainly wanted to avoid that for him. So in 1913 he left Russia and came to Baltimore. While he was living there, he taught Hebrew, and he attended Johns Hopkins University. In 1923, he was hired as the principal of the Mikveh Israel School in Philadelphia. Mikveh Israel was the congregation that oversaw the formation of Gratz College. It had been the congregation that the Gratz family belonged to. And the school of Mikveh Israel was attached to Gratz. It was kind of a lab school for the college, for the teachers who were training there. So in 1923, he became the principal of the school, and in 1924, he was hired as professor of Hebrew at Gratz College. He was a remarkable visionary, and by 1932 already, he had become head of the faculty, a position that he held all the way through 1969. This is a picture of 3/4 of the Chomsky family. William is on the right, Elsie is in the middle, and their older son Noam is on the left. I swear this must be Noam's bar mitzvah picture, because he looks all dressed up in a suit just like every 13-year-old boy I know who has gone through the process. Anyway, William Chomsky was not the first professor of Hebrew at Gratz. Gratz was founded with a notion that Hebrew should play an enormous, significant role in the school. The first professor of Hebrew at Gratz was Isaac Husick. He was hired in 1897. He was one of the first 3 professors hired full-time to teach at the college, and he was professor of Hebrew and Bible until 1922. Chomsky comes in 1924, and he revolutionized what was going on within the Hebrew program at the college. The first thing he did was he introduced Ivrit be'Ivrit as a method of teaching. That was a method that was based on the direct method that we're learning about this week, but it was the direct method as it's applied to Hebrew. Courses were actually taught in Hebrew, and I'm not even talking about Hebrew courses. I am talking about literature and Bible and education and Jewish history. The language of instruction at Gratz College for many years was Hebrew. And in fact, professors, in order to get hired at Gratz, had to be interviewed in Hebrew to make sure that their Hebrew was up to teaching in the class. That was a practice that was still in play at Gratz 30-some years ago when Dr. Sandberg became professor at Gratz College. Chomsky himself was a real specialist in the area of Hebrew grammar, and especially in the historical tradition of Hebrew grammar study. He was a particular follower of David Kimhi, who was a grammarian in the 12th century. He actually wrote his doctoral dissertation on Kimhi and later published a book about him and also a translation of his work. He emphasized the idea that Hebrew was needed especially so that students could learn to read the classical texts in the original language. He did not like translations of the Bible or the Mishnah. He wanted students to study the texts in the language in which they were written. And because of that, he sort of lost, he became disillusioned, I guess is how one could best describe it, with Ivrit B'Ivrit as a method, because he felt it didn't emphasize reading enough. And he eventually became a proponent of a method called the reading method, which is no longer in use at all anywhere. It was developed in England and came to America. It lasted a very short amount of time. Chomsky knew about it, and he actually wrote a textbook for how to use it to teach Hebrew, but it was not a method that really took off. Independently, he was a researcher of medieval Hebrew, which is quite different from either biblical or modern Hebrew. And when he passed away in 1977, he was so important in the world of Hebrew grammar and Hebrew language and Hebrew teaching that his obituary was actually published in the New York Times, and it described him as one of the world's foremost Hebrew grammarians. Chomsky himself did not create any methods in language teaching. He did promote a couple during the course of his career. He went from one to another. He never embraced the audiolingual method, but he also never really paid much attention to it or challenged it. And yet there is a connection coming very shortly, as you'll see, about challenges to that method. But just as a quick review, you will remember that the audiolingual method is based on the behaviorist notions of how a language is acquired, and the behaviorists believe that language acquisition is a matter of proper language habit formation. In that respect, they considered errors to be bad, to be avoided at all costs, to be corrected if they were made, and to try to keep them from happening at all. They believed in particular that errors were the result of the first language interfering with the habit formation in the second language. And to help combat that, they developed an entire process known as contrastive analysis, which took the two languages and compared them to each other, looking for areas where they were different. And the belief was that if you could identify those areas of difference, you could plan the instruction so that you would prevent the errors from happening in the first place. But actually, what happened was that contrastive analysis began to show that languages share more in common than they have differences, that the deep structures are the same, or that there are limited choices, maybe 2 or 3 ways of doing something, that languages are much more similar than they are different. The surface areas are different. The vocabulary is different. The specific way grammar is used may be different, but the differences are quite limited. And that helped to bring down the whole notion of behaviorism's view of language acquisition and the audiolingual method in particular. That happened as a result of William and Elsie Chomsky's oldest son, Noam. older son. They had two sons. Noam changed the family name pronunciation from Chomsky to Chomsky. You may have heard of Noam Chomsky. He is to this day the most important linguist in the modern world, certainly in the United States. He actually studied at Graz. He attended Graz. He learned to speak Hebrew at Graz. And he went on from Graz to go to University of Pennsylvania. While he was doing his undergraduate work there, he became very enamored of the whole notion of linguistics and the study of language as a whole system. He actually wrote his master's thesis on Hebrew, on some linguistic aspects of the Hebrew language. And after he finished his PhD, he was hired by MIT to be a professor in their linguistics department. In 1959, he created a revolution in the world of language and linguistics. He wrote a review of B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, and he attacked the actual foundation of behaviorist theory regarding language acquisition. Chomsky emphasized the contributions that children make to their own first language acquisition. He noted that children will say things that they have never heard anybody say before. Certainly they are not imitating or mimicking their parents. They are creating something entirely new. And he held that in order for that to happen, there had to be some kind of mechanism within the brain, inborn, innate, in the human being, that would help them learn language, that would propel them to become language speakers, that would allow them to master any human language. And he called that mechanism the universal grammar. You'll learn a little bit more about Chomsky's approach in the video that's posted for this week. Now, Chomsky himself, like his dad, did not create a method. He didn't promote a method. In fact, he focused primarily on first language acquisition, not on second language acquisition. But those who followed him did study second language acquisition, and some of them went on to develop methods, but many of those methods are actually based on an older model, a model that is known as the direct method. This is a very old approach. It actually has its roots in the humanist school, and especially in the work of a teacher by the name of Guarino Guarini. Guarini lived from 1374 to 1460, and he believed that Latin, because this was all about teaching Latin, that Latin should be taught as a spoken language, not purely as a written language, that it should be taught in the language itself, that it should not be taught through translation, that it should focus on creativity and self-expression rather than just on studying classical texts, and that errors were a natural part of this and should just be ignored, that they would eventually work themselves out. And he actually proposed, as far as reading is concerned, that it not follow the typical grammar translation method of translating word for word. He said, rather, when you read, don't go word by word. Rather, pay attention only to the meaning, and as though you were trying to grab the entire body, not just an appendage. In other words, don't try to understand just one word, try to understand the whole concept. And to do that, he recommended doing it through the medium of the target language. Unfortunately, he was never able to articulate his approach in a method that could be replicated by other teachers. His son, Batista, was asked to do that, and when Batista sat down and wrote, he completely reversed his father's opinion. When he wrote about his father's method, he said certain things like the following. In teaching, the fact that verb tenses are formed according to a general rule is of the utmost importance. And he went on to recommend drilling verbs as conjugations, conjugating them, drilling them with substitution drills, the same tired methods that had been used in the grammar translation method. Battista claimed had been his father's approach, when in fact his father had taken a completely different approach, but left it in the hands of others to try to describe what that approach was. We'll see this kind of cycle repeated multiple times in the course of history of language education, that we will go from a cognitive method like grammar translation to a revolution of a more naturalistic approach, which will then cycle back to the traditional grammar translation cognitive approach, only to have that repeated, a reversal again with a new naturalistic approach. And so this happens over and over and over again. And it happened next, a century after the Guarini effort at creating a direct method. The next person who did this was Ignatius Loyola, who again was there alive in 1491 to 1556. Loyola was a Jesuit who founded the Jesuit schools, and he also promoted teaching Latin as a spoken language, not correcting errors, trying to encourage self-expression, and so on. Again, he did not write out a method. He simply articulated a philosophy. And when his assistant was tasked with writing out the method, his assistant again relied on grammar drills and conjugations and translation into the native tongue. A century later, almost, we get to John Amos Comenius, also known as Johannes Amos Comenius. He was born in 1592. He lived till 1670. He was born in Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. And Comenius was a pedagogue, a philosopher, a theologian, and he is considered by many to be the father of modern education. In fact, many of what we take for granted, many of the things we take for granted in education, we can trace right back to Comenius. For example, he felt that learning should be structured in such a way that it goes from simple to complex. You'd think that's obvious, but it was not obvious prior to Comenius, and he was the first to really articulate that as a sound pedagogic strategy. He believed that the poor should have equal access to learning that the rich had. He believed that women should be educated on an equal basis with men. He believed that sensory education was critical. It should be active. The student should be engaged and an active participant in the process. And in fact, he recommended multisensory approaches rather than simply relying on, say, the sense of sight. First and foremost, Comenius was a Latin teacher, and in 1631 he published his book Janua Linguarum Reserrata, The Gates of Language Unlocked. And in this he articulated his idea that the words of a language, the vocabulary, should be taught not through translation, but directly through using real objects or pictures. And he said, he quoted, the quote from his book is, "Nihil est in intellectu quod non prius fuerit in sensu." Nothing comes into the mind, nothing exists in the mind that does not come by way of the senses. His treatise, which actually spelled out a method, was widely circulated throughout Europe. It gained enormous popularity. Unfortunately, Comenius did not have the same fate as his ideas. He was often persecuted because he was a Protestant living in Catholic countries during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, a very dangerous time to be a Protestant. And he ended up moving from country to country to country in Europe, searching for a safe haven. He initially left Moravia and went to Poland, and while in Poland, he published his next book, which he referred to as Orbis Sensualium Pictus. It means the world, the sensual or the sensory world in pictures. I've also seen it translated as the visual world in pictures, but it was more than just that. This is actually a page from that book. Each item in the picture, you'll notice these are every lesson in every chapter in the book is accompanied by at least one of these copper plate drawings, and each item in the picture is numbered. This happens to be a depiction of life on the farm, and you see a shepherd. He's got his shepherd's crook and a cane, his dog, the sheep. Up further there is a guy blowing a horn, and you have cows, and you have the farmer's wife milking a cow in the barn, and so on and so forth. And each item is labeled with a number, and underneath this drawing, the numbered items, you'll have the corresponding numbers with the word for that item in Latin, also used in a sentence, and opposite a translation into the first language. So the words were introduced not through translation but through pictures, with a translation provided kind of as a crutch, but the emphasis was on directly associating the picture with the words. Interestingly enough, there had been lots of illustrations in books prior to this, but this was the first time that pictures were used for pedagogic purposes, not just as decorations on the page. And in fact, what was so revolutionary about this was that the pictures were an integral part of the teaching method. You couldn't teach this method without using the pictures. Because Comenius had been able to articulate a vision and a method, and it was something that could be spelled out so that other teachers could replicate it, and of course because he created the textbook, he has come to be considered the father of the direct method, even though this is a method that had its roots much earlier than his. But he was able to articulate how to do this. And in part, he believed that the word and the object should have a direct association between them. So to do that, he used pictures and realia. Realia are the real items. He incorporated movement and pantomime to act out verbs. He made it multisensory and active so that the students were involved and engaged in what was going on. The lesson was taught in the target language so that the learner was left to deduce what the grammatical structures were and what the meanings of sentences were. This is known as the inductive approach to grammar instruction. The picture does illustrate one pitfall with this particular method, and that is not every student gets the message of what the meaning is immediately. Most do. Most students have absolutely no problem understanding this. You'll see that a little bit later illustrated in the Gavagai principle. Most learners have no trouble with this, but some have a lot of trouble with this. Some students just misunderstand what is being said. And you can see in the classroom, the teacher is describing a tree. Most of the students have that concept in their minds, but there are some that have question marks over their heads. One thinks it might be a cow that's being discussed rather than a tree. Somebody else just has a question, and someone else has concluded it's some other object. This is a real pitfall of both inductive grammar and also of the direct method of association of of the words to the pictures. One of the things used in direct method, there are several strategies used for acting out grammar. One of them is pantomime, as I had mentioned. Another is using the second language to explain the second language. So let's say the students understand the word yesh. Yesh li kova. How would I say the opposite of that? Well, a student might say lo yesh kova, lo yesh li kova. And the teacher would have to respond by saying lo yesh, ein, ze lo yesh, ein kova, ein li kova. It's one of the methods that is promoted within the direct method approach. So Comenius, his method was very popular. It was translated into every language under the sun in Europe. It was first published in 1658. That was a Latin-German edition. A year later, there was a Latin-French edition. A year after that, a Latin-English edition. Pretty soon, there was one in Dutch and one in the Scandinavian languages, and on and on and on. And it was very popular for a time. But then Latin kind of went out of vogue. It became something that was restricted only for studying the classics, and to study the classics they reverted back to the old grammar method. And so once again we have the cycle of a revolution of a naturalistic method followed by a return to the traditional cognitive method. But by the mid-19th century, Europe was undergoing some pretty big societal transformations, mostly brought on by the Industrial Revolution. But there was suddenly an increase in international trade and especially travel. And if you're going to travel to a foreign country, you might want to be able to say a few words in the language of that country just so that you can get around. Like you might want to ask where the lavatory is. You might want to be able to order something off a restaurant menu. You might want to be able to rent a room in a hotel or to find your way to the train station, and so on and so forth. And the grammar translation method just was not workable. Not really, it was workable, but it was not really producing great success in learning modern languages. And so by the mid-19th century, there was a revival of direct method approaches. Lots of schools began to spring up to promote international travel and learning a little bit of language so you could go someplace. Berlitz was one of the big proponents of this. Started a school to train people to, travel to all over the place. And again, the direct method was the method of choice, and it traveled all across Europe with different direct method schools cropping up in different places. Of course, it also made its way into the Jewish community, and the Zionist leaders began to adapt this approach for teaching Hebrew, not quite as a living language, sort of as a living language, even before Ben Yehuda showed up on the scene. And the Zionists were producing written work in Hebrew. There were Hebrew presses in Odessa. The Haskalah produced enormous numbers of Hebrew language newspapers and journals, not necessarily to promote speaking the language, but to promote reading the language, because it was kind of the universal Jewish language. There were groups that spoke Yiddish, there were groups that spoke Ladino, there were groups that spoke Arabic, but Hebrew was the one language that every group had in common, at least had access to in common. And so the Zionist leaders began really promoting Hebrew as a universal Jewish language. And of course, once Ben Yehuda showed up on the scene, it became the whole point became making it a new living language all over again. And of course, the obvious method for teaching that was Ivrit be'Ivrit, because again, there were in Palestine, in the Yeshuv, There were people who spoke Ladino and people who spoke Yiddish and people who spoke Arabic, and Hebrew was the one language that they all had in common. So that was the method that they adopted for teaching Hebrew in Palestine, and it became the basis of the Ulpan method. There have been some changes, but it's still basically the same approach. And so we come full circle. We are back in the Chomsky reading room at Gratz College. I'm standing here in front of a display case with Madeline. Madeline was one of our dual enrollment students. She was a high school student studying Hebrew with us. And what was really wonderful about this is that Madeline actually learned how to read Hebrew in 3rd grade using my little primer, which is on display in the bottom shelf there. It's that little yellow book with the Aleph and the Bet and the Gimel on the cover. It's called Aleph Bet Quest. And that is how Madeline learned how to read Hebrew. It's also interesting that Aleph Bet Quest incorporates an awful lot of direct method approaches to teaching Hebrew. Each lesson has a couple of key words. For example, one of the lessons, the key word is Shemesh and Geshem. And Shemesh is illustrated with a picture of the sun, and Geshem shows a cloud with raindrops coming out of it. Again, using direct method techniques to teach Hebrew vocabulary, and from the vocabulary to teach the sounds and symbols of the language. Direct method there. And here we are in the Chomsky reading room. Chomsky himself had brought Ivrit Be'Ivrit, the direct method, to Gratz College. And there's yet one other marvelous little bookend on this, and that is on the shelf above my head, top shelf, really right over my head, there is a little blue book, blue and orange and yellow on the cover, and that is a book by Noam Chomsky, who was the person who showed the flaws in the foundation of the behaviorist approach, who started us off on the road of modern linguistics, which has provided so much support for direct method and other naturalistic approaches. And so we have Chomsky to me to Madeline, and now it's totally appropriate that this understanding goes to you as students of Gratz College, and in particular Hebrew students and Hebrew teachers learning how to teach Hebrew language at Gratz.